Hello there, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today I have a full tank review on the C2A1, which is basically a Leopard A1A1 variant, and this is the reward that you can get for 10 stars in the ongoing Operation S.U.M.M.E.R 2020. And this is a full review, so no first impressions and also no raw pure gameplay. It is a bit of a combination of gameplay in the background with an in-depth look at all the bolts and screws of this tank, and we will have a look at the armor, we have a look at the x-ray, we will have a look at the ammunition, and also a statistical comparison to its major opponents on the battlefield, and a few things up front. First of all, I got this tank from Gaijin for a test drive, fully spaded, and when you get this tank you will get a tank that is completely stocked, so just like a Tech Tree tank with no premium Civil Line modifier and no premium RP modifier. However, people might ask the question if this tank is a candidate for a talisman if you are not having any other high tier tanks and you don't want to spend a ridiculous amounts of money on the Leopard A1A1 L44. If you play for this, you get it free and you put a talisman to ease the grind for this and also try to get more RP towards your tactic grind. Now this is an intriguing idea and for some people it might work. However, as a short verdict, this is your standard average Western MBT with one extra trick upon its sleeve, and this is the add-on protection around the turret and the hull on the side especially, which makes it a bit trolley versus heat and hash, but not versus chemical energy based weapons. Now without further ado, I think I also will show at the end a part where I recommend all the upgrades that you have to get in the best way and best order to make the stock grind as easy as possible or as sensible as possible. Now without further ado, now let's go into the review. Let's begin with the armor, then the x-ray, then a comparison, and from there on then also some replays or actual recordings of battles that I had in the background. I hope you enjoy. As usual, I want to begin with a good look at the armor, and let's begin with the hull. And yeah, it is actually a 70mm plating on the upper frontal glacis, and also on the lower glacis we have 50mm. On top of this we have a composite screen with various different thicknesses. The funny thing is that versus kinetic energy rounds, the upper frontal glacis is a bit better, but not really all that great. And versus chemical energy based weaponry, the lower glacis is a bit more resilient, except this part here, which has no composite screen. Then we come to the side of the tank, and it is as usual relatively thin. We can see here that it is just 30mm, so even SPA will eat this tank. And also some kinetic energy based weaponry, APHE, APDS, APFSTS and so forth. The fun part begins when you get shot by heat rounds, and this composite screen looks very thick, but this is not steel, so versus kinetic energy based weaponry it's not all that great. So the tank can be all around penned by a long 88 for instance, or the Soviet 100mm, etc. But versus heat, this not just eats 90mm heat, but also 105mm heat, so 400mm, and even 120mm Western MBT stock heat FS gets absorbed, funnily enough, if you angle the tank. And so this might surprise some enemies that are not aware of this, and the same goes for the turret. And even if it doesn't completely stop the heat FS round, it strongly mitigates the incoming post-penetration damage effect. Now first of all, there is obviously the effect from the composite screen, but also the sheer spacing, so it looks a bit thick. But obviously from the front, even a BMP-1's 73mm heat grenade will go through this part here. Then we come to the turret, and yeah, this is a bit of a stormtrooper meme, I guess. yeah, there is the gun mantlet and also the turret front, and it is relatively thin. And also here around the turret ring, in good War Thunder fashion, that's a weak spot for all kinds of ammunition. Hell, even SPA can easily pen here. But the upper part of the gun mantlet is protected by, again, this composite screen, and the rest of the hull is practically your normal Leopard A1A1 hull. So I think in that aspect it is relatively vulnerable, but it can troll, especially stock players, high tier stock players that is, that now have to deal with Heat FS. Not the greatest and the most elegant change, but you know, you shouldn't play War Thunder if you can't take a Gaijin choke. So yeah, that is the armor protection. What about the interior? Well, you can see that the turret looks very big and wide and long, but the part where the actual crew is relatively tiny. And so out of the 4 crew, 3 are in the turret, very closely packed together, and so the crew is 3 out of the 4 are on the left hand side if you look at the tank, right hand side if you drive this, and also in the hull is a very big ammo rack. And even if you empty a big portion of it, this ready rack is always relatively easy to hit from the side, from the front, and so this will blow up very often. A turret ring shot mostly is also deadly. Either an ammunition blow up still, because some fragments even hitting the tip, that counts as still the ammunition going off, and also, as I said, 3 out of the 4 crew are in the turret. So now let's have a look at some other statistics and let's see where the tank actually stands in a comparison to its opponents on the battlefield. So now let's start the comparison with the mobility aspects, and the C2A1 has the same engine as the L44, the premium variant, and it has 830. That is certainly not the worst, but also far from the best. However, then it has 44.0 tons of weight, which is exactly 1 ton more, which is down to the composite add-on screen armor. So the horsepower to ton ratio is a bit less than the L44, but still 18.9 is certainly not bad. But as you can see, it is not by any stretch of the imagination the worst. That goes to the Chieftain Mark 10. But then it's also not the best, but it's still acceptable and it's still good. The top speed is also fairly nice with 65 kilometers per hour, although on medium terrain you are obviously mostly significantly less. The reverse speed is a nice minus 25 kilometers per hour, so you can take a shot and then reposition fairly quickly without swinging the entirety of the tank around. And also you have neutral steering to help you in close quarters engagements, or when you have little room to maneuver. All in all, the mobility and the maneuverability are fairly okay. They are fairly decent. They are up to the standards of the majority of Western MBTs. But you know, there are faster machines, but then there are also slower machines. However, the tank feels, especially at lower speeds, surprisingly sluggish, and there is a difference noticeable to the L44 and also the A1A1 Tech Tree variant. So now finally let's talk about the business end of the C2A1, and that is the all-singing, all-dancing L7A3 105mm gun. It is a lower caliber than the L44's infamous Rheinmetall L44, but it shares the reload with it, and also the rest of the handling is the same. So this might be a bit surprising. On the other hand, the reload, for instance, of 6.7 seconds with a fully trained aced crew is the gold standard for the majority, if not all, the Western MBDs, be it Tech Tree or Premium. And that is something where you have an advantage versus the autoloaders, for example on the XM803, which has a longer reload but keeps it even if it would lose crew. And so here you have the 6.7 just under the very best of circumstances. So still it is kind of average and everybody has it, and it's not a disadvantage. Then we have the turret rotation speed. 24 degrees per second is certainly not bad. Not the best. That again goes to the XM803, but it's certainly not the worst. However, it feels like that the add-on armor giving the turret a bit more momentum, and so it takes a bit longer for whatever it uses to to do the turret rotation to pick up that speed and also to slow it down, so it's not as snappy and quick as I was used from such tanks in the past. But it's not the end of the world, it's just a quick side note. Then we have the gun depression. -9 degrees is not bad, but it's not quite reaching the gold standard of -10 degrees. There are certain situations where just a little bit more would be what would allow you to get the kill shot on an enemy. But again, at least you have 20 degrees of gun elevation. Now, I need to point out here that the Type 74G looks really bad with -6 and +9 degrees, but it has also hydropneumatic suspension, and that will help it, but that requires the tank to stop, and then it requires to flip the tank forwards or backwards, whatever, and that is just where the tank is not that good in my aspects. Another aspect that I really need to point out is thermal imaging. Now, first of all, the C2A1 has it, just like the L44 and the before mentioned Type 74G. However, it's not the world's best and most crystal clear thermal imaging. I think it's first generation, something like this, and you only have it for the gunner, not for the commander's binoculars. However, that is still something that you can use and should unlock ASAP, because it allows you to have an advantage even in broad daylight, where a night vision device is not really useful, you can't even activate it. But thermal imaging helps you to spot enemies that are moving between bushes at long range. It screws a little bit with your Mark 1 eyeball range finding, where it can throw off your distance guessing. But on the other hand, if you have like a nuclear sun in your face, then thermal imaging is awesome, especially then obviously unsurprisingly in night battles as well. Now let's talk about the ammunition of this tank, and we begin with the DM12 HeatFS stock round. 1173 meters per second mass velocity and 400 millimeters of penetration at any distance. HeatFS gets detonated prematurely and therefore uses all its power on bushes, fences, trees, also ear protection, and to a certain degree also spaced armor or some nearer elements can greatly reduce the damage that this shell provides. However, it also can hull break by not hitting directly critical compartments on light tank and SPA, and also it has the advantage of being free and maintaining that damage at any distance. However, it is to be said that in the majority of fights, this shell versus APFSDS is at a disadvantage, and you know, this is the new stock meta, so it's not the greatest of shells, but it's definitely not worthless, it's definitely not pointless, and yeah, a few of them with you for special situations, for instance sniping helicopters, that is really where it has an advantage over APFSDS. Yes, I know it's a very niche situation, but you should keep this in mind. The second shell type is the DM502 hash round with a mass velocity of 732 meters per second and a penetration of 127 millimeters against any angle at any distance. This is in many cases very similar to the heat round. It detonates very prematurely on bushes, fences, trees, etc., and also gets absorbed by era, nearer, and spaced armor. However, when you make the connection, it can also hull break lightly protected vehicles, you know, light tanks, SPA, etc., and also it can splash, and the post-penetration damage effect is fairly nice. And the low mass velocity means that in theory you can lob this shell over ridgelines while you're in cover from APFSDS rounds, but this is also a rather rare situation, but you might take a few with you into battle anyway. Another tier 1 modification, which is significantly more desirable, is the DM23 APFSDS round with a whopping 1455 meters per second mass velocity and 337 millimeters of penetration at 0 degrees angles of attack, and still 193 millimeters against 60 degrees angles of attack at point blank range. This is the meta shell, I would say. A lot of premium and also tech tree tanks have this in their arsenal, and it is really good for hitting the gun breaches, hitting turret rings, punching through steel armor, and also going through the side or the angled side of an enemy tank. It does the job. The post-penetration damage effect is acceptable, but it costs you 200 silver lines per shot. So this is something at tier 1 that helps you with the further grind to the top shell, and also the engine upgrades, and obviously also the thermal imaging. The fourth and last shell type is indeed a tier 4 modification. The DM33 AP round shares the mass velocity of 1455 meters per second with the DM23 and has a bit more penetration with 408 millimeters against 0 degrees angles of attack, and 60 degrees angles of attack still get you 236 millimeters of penetration at point blank range. And it also keeps this at distance where we still have 370 millimeters at 2000 meters. So if we then compare this to, for example, the L44, we can see that it has an advantage at practically all angles, but the mass velocity is lower and the difference is not that huge, and it still is kind of average if we compare this to the Chieftain Mark X. But it obviously then significantly outperforms the XM803's AP round, for example, and is not really that different to also the Type 74G's AP run, just to give here a shout out to the premium tanks. So those are the shell types, and what kind of shells would I use? Well, if you have it, the DM33 as your standard shell, probably 20 rounds or so, and then either 5 hash or 5 heat rounds. And obviously if you don't have the tier 4 modification, then obviously the DM23 as a replacement for the DM33 till you get the DM33, that is. So then finally let's talk about the way of the upgrades. The order of modifications that you have to research depend on your playstyle, but I think that in general you would begin with parts and the DM23, and I would actually begin with the DM23 because once you are hit, you're most likely dead anyway. Then obviously FPE and adjustment of fire, and after this I would go instantly for the night vision device, aka the thermal imaging, and then the smoke grenades, which can help you quite a lot. Then I would go for the laser rangefinder and then the DM33, then the artillery support, and when we then come to the mobility, I would begin with the engines, because the engines give you combined as much horsepower as the filter and transmission upgrade combined. And obviously then from the engine I would go to the tracks and then the filters and transmissions, depending on your progress and the RP that you have, and then at the end suspension and brake system. And if you get shot a lot, then you might also consider crew replenishment a bit earlier or later, depending on your playstyle, and also artillery support depending on your playstyle. Again, so DM23, parts, FPE, adjustment of fire, night vision device, smoke, laser rangefinder, DM33, and then the other remaining upgrades. This is how I would do it. At the end of the review, only 2 questions remain. First of all, how to play this tank, aka the playstyle, and then second of all, what is the tank worth in my opinion for the upcoming marketplace battle. And here is the thing. First of all, this is not a brawler. This is nothing that you should send to the front line expecting to survive any sort of hits. The majority of the enemies are still shooting AP FSTs, and even if the enemy has heat loaded or hash, you need to show your side, you need to be angled, he must not shoot your weak spots, etc, etc, etc. So you never should rely on it. It can happen that you're lucky and it can help you, yes, but you should not rely on it. It is a great support vehicle. It is, with the DM33, even a great sniper, and you should use it with care and patience as usual, and then it brings in the results. The next thing is obviously, what is the tank worth? Well, I think it depends. If you really like top tier tanks, if you wanna equip this tank even with a talisman, which costs you also even around $20, so you are not saving all that much. And then you have a tank that isn't really good at researching low tiers as a rank 6 gift tank with a talisman. If you buy that thing again, which it doesn't have by default, then you don't get extra silver lines, so you're making no money whatsoever, and it still comes stock. So if you really want to play it, I would set it at $30, and that includes kind of the value for collectors. I mean, yeah, it's a kind of unique tank in that aspect, or a unique Leopard tank, but it's not that outstanding. And when it comes to the firepower, there is, for example, also the Radkampfwagen 90, which pretty much does the same with better mobility. So yeah, that is my opinion on this tank. It is actually painfully average. It is painfully standard amongst all the Western MBTs. It has probably a one-trick pony, and that is the trolliness of the era protection, not era, Nera, so with the side skirts, but that is again unreliable as all hell. And that is it for me today. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a like, give it a subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see each other on the ways in the skies and on the battlefields of War Thunder.